How's it going? Good. All right. Rolling.
One question.
Yeah?
Theo, do you require sound? Okay, good.
Oh, you mean like from my computer? No, no.
Yeah.
Are we going? We're good? Hi, everybody. My name's Lee Vinsel, and I am one of the organizers of the STS seminar here at Virginia Tech, along with my colleague Fernando Rosa and our trusty graduate assistant, Oliver Shuey, who's sitting right next to me over here. Before I get going, I want to, sometimes I forget to do this and I kick myself, but I really want to extend my thanks to the staff members of the Athenaeum, the production team here, who are making this very nice live stream and recording possible. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to have this kind of wonderful year experimenting with media in this way. And with that, I would like to introduce our speaker, Theo Lim, who is an assistant professor of urban affairs and planning within the School of Public and International Affairs, or SPIA, here at Virginia Tech, which we're very lucky moved over to our college, the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences, within the last year. And Theo has a degree in planning from University of Pennsylvania, if I have that right, and is doing all kinds of interesting work thinking about trauma-informed and healing-centered practices around urban works and problems. And he's going to talk to us today about trauma-informed healing-centered planning with subtitles, Transformations in the Face of Global Climate Change. So Theo, thanks so much for joining us. You can take it away, man.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me here today. Let's see, is it gonna cut to my slides or?
Whenever you're ready. Yep.
There we go.
Okay. Yep. So thanks, Lee, for the introduction. The title of my presentation today is Trauma-Informed and Healing-Centered Planning and Transformations in the Face of Global Climate Change. So lots of big words there, but to get us started, I'd like to reflect for a moment on how we've been thinking about transformation through some of the projects that you'll hear me talk about today. So in 1968, Apollo 8 sent astronauts into space on a mission that circled the moon for the first time. Many people watched it on television, and at a certain point, one of the astronauts that was on the mission said, "We're going to turn the camera around and show you the Earth." When he did that, it was actually the first time that many people had ever seen the planet hanging in space like that, and many described it as a profound experience. So I'd like to read a quotation from one of those people. They said, "I think that for me, like for many other people, it was quite a shock. I don't think any of us had expectations about how it would give us a different perspective. I think the focus had been, we're going to the stars, we're going to the planets, and suddenly we look back at ourselves, and it seems to imply a new kind of self-awareness." One of the astronauts said, "When we originally went to the moon, our total focus was on the moon. We weren't thinking about looking back at the Earth, but now that we've done it, it might well have been the most important reason we went." So what you'll hear about today is our attempt, our team's attempt to begin to make sense of some of the experiences we've had in our participatory action research projects in Roanoke, Virginia. And while our projects largely focus on how to build community capacity to deal with rising temperatures in the city, it's also been this process of turning the camera on ourselves. It's been this period of intense reflection. Who are we? How do we relate to each other, and why? And so we'd like to suggest that the way that transformation is occurring is mostly through modeling transformations of ourselves, personally and organizationally. And through this process, trauma-informed and healing-centered practice principles have been key to helping us achieve that transformation. So I also had the word trauma in the title, and so I want to think about for a moment how we are thinking about trauma. So for a lot of people, when we talk about trauma, it makes you think of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Which occurs after you've experienced a kind of acute event, right? Like coming back from war or something like that. But the way that mental and behavioral health practitioners and researchers are now thinking about trauma is to recognize that there are also complex, what we call complex historical, collective, and intergenerational trauma that does not exhibit that differently, frankly, from some of the ways that that PTSD is also exhibited. And so some of the examples that contribute to complex historical, collective, and intergenerational trauma might be things like exposure to substance use in the family, incarceration and policing within communities, exposure to community and domestic violence, especially at young ages, experiences of poverty and homelessness, racism, displacement, which are all related to policies and state actions and inactions. And you can probably imagine that a lot of these examples as well are also spatial in nature. So they tend to correlate and be concentrated because of our policies and state actions and inactions within certain communities. More and more, mental and behavioral health specialists are also recognizing the impacts of natural disasters on communities, which are also spatial in nature, including exposure to extreme heat and the risks of rising temperatures in particular communities. On the right there is a book that maybe some of you have heard about, given our proximity to Roanoke. It's a book called Root Shock. So this idea of intergenerational trauma, in this case caused by a period called urban renewal that happened across North America, where there was a lot of infrastructure and civic infrastructure and public infrastructure investment that actually ended up displacing whole neighborhoods and communities of African American residents. Dr. Mindy Fuller-Love writes about that process of displacement as a root shock to an entire community that has intergenerational effects. And she writes about that from a mental and behavioral health, social psychology kind of perspective, using Roanoke as a case example. So one of 3 case examples in root shock is the story of Roanoke, which I'll get into more in a second. So how I started doing my participatory action research in Roanoke was actually almost 4 or 5 years ago at this point. Roanoke had just completed an urban heat mapping campaign funded by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They were mapping air temperatures across the city, which has resulted in the map that you see, the visualization you see on the left. You can see that in different areas of the city, we often know about the urban heat island effect, right? That urban areas are hotter than the surrounding rural areas, but you can see that there's almost a 15-degree difference even within the city. We call that the intra-urban heat island effect. So the redder hues there, of course, correspond with hotter temperatures. The bluer hues correspond with cooler temperatures. And what you see on the right there is a map of historical redlining by the Homeowners Loan Corporation from the 1930s. And if you squint, you can kind of see that there's a spatial correlation between some of the hottest areas in the city and those that were previously redlined. So that indicates, is a proxy for housing segregation and historical disinvestment in those same neighborhoods. So how have we encountered trauma in our community engaged work when trying to address this issue of rising temperatures? And I should say, maybe a backup for a second, that we happen to be in a region that's higher in elevation compared to much of the South, and so we have, people think of Roanoke as having milder temperatures compared to other southern cities in the US. But if global climate change projections proceed as they're expected to, the climate in Roanoke is likely to become much more like that of Tuscaloosa, Alabama in the next 50 years than it has to its own historical past. And so there's a lot of issues there related to the housing stock, weatherization, availability of air conditioning, affordability of air conditioning that kind of compound for this particular location. So how have we encountered trauma in our community engaged work? And we've already seen that, that rising temperatures are already an issue in Roanoke. Well, first, and perhaps the most obvious thing, is there is this distrust of any city-led initiative in Northwest, which is the area that we're working in, one of the hotter areas of the city. Happens to be majority black as well, previously redlined area of the city, including well-intentioned efforts. So one example that I often give is, you know, that has been raised often in my interactions with the residents here. You know, the city has policies to put in bike lanes to improve safety for people who are choosing to commute in different ways, right? When the residents of Northwest heard about the bike lanes, there was a ton of pushback to it, unexpectedly, because they had been organizing for years for transportation-related infrastructure, mostly related to the bus lines, bus shelters, frequency, and dependability of the bus service. And suddenly the city planners come in and they're like, we have bike lanes for you. And they're like, where have, you know, why have our concerns have been repeatedly ignored and you're coming to us with bike lanes? Like, who even rides bikes here? Our kids ride bikes in the streets without bike lanes, so who is this for? Yeah. And in that particular example, that decision to put in bike lanes also corresponded with a redrawing of boundaries of what constitutes downtown Roanoke versus the historically African-American neighborhoods. And so there's this perception of you're extending the boundaries of what you're considering and selling to real estate developers as downtown, but it's basically looking like a land grab of our historically African-American neighborhoods, and simultaneously putting in bike lanes, and hopefully you can see why that triggers, like, who is this actually for? Another example, this is the picture on the right there you see is an example of a serious game that we've developed for high school students in Roanoke to learn about parks planning. Essentially that different users have different preferences for the park, thinking about different perspectives and how to negotiate coming to one design for a park when different people may have different priorities for the park. So essentially, a serious game in our case is a sort of manufacturing a kind of conflict in a game setting to help people think through how do you resolve conflict. But when you're working with communities that deal with very intense kinds of conflict on a day-to-day basis, in our experience, what we think of as a game very quickly escalates into high levels of conflict between the players. So another example there. Another example with, you know, we did a urban sensing program with middle schoolers in Roanoke where we gave them temperature measuring equipment, had them go to different stops in their schoolyard and measure temperature, have them correlate that with different elements in the built environment. And in one of our classes, one of these girls in the class started, you might say, acting out, right? She threw the equipment on the ground, she threw the clipboard on the ground, she refused to participate in the activity. And so our team is trained in trauma-informed methods, and so we're not going to deal with that kind of a situation with discipline, right? And so we just, you know, escorted her to the shade where she could, you know, take a break from the activity. Later on, because this science activity was paired with urban planning, we actually had a chance to, for the students to share their stories of experiences with heat. And this young girl whispered to me and said that the previous summer her dog had died in their home from heat exposure. And so pairing a science, what we think of as like a very objective, objective science activity is not completely divorced from people's lived experiences. And you never know when you're working with with community that has experienced high levels of trauma and other kinds of challenges, what could be the trigger of some of the behaviors that you're maybe unexpected behaviors that you observe. So just to reiterate, dealing with conflicts, feelings of loss and grief, and unhealed conflicts between organizations and people. In this case, the residents' relationships even with each other and between the residents and the city of Roanoke are some examples of that. So what can we learn from mental and behavioral health, where trauma-informed care is much more developed over the past few decades here? So they talk about there being 4 steps to trauma-informed care. First, you need to realize the widespread nature of trauma, and that it is spatial in our case. Second, recognizing in any given event or interaction with somebody how trauma might be impacting somebody. So not assuming that this girl was causing trouble or didn't want to engage in a learning activity, but that perhaps there's some other reason influencing what is going on. You want to be able to respond in a way that allows people to be heard, and then you want to resist, of course, re-traumatizing populations that have already been traumatized and promote healing. So I come from the field of urban planning, and we have a deep literature in related topics with trauma-informed care and emotions in general, and how you deal with that in public and collective decision-making. So emotions and planning, community engagement itself as through thinking about the future as a therapeutic kind of activity that people can engage in, that is not just, it sometimes doesn't become as self-indulgent, so to speak, but allows people to focus on the material and community aspects of their experience. Urban planning, we need to also recognize as complicit in some of these causes of intergenerational community trauma. So I mentioned urban renewal. Urban planning has had a role in that, and so we have to, there's kind of a normative aspect to recognizing that we need to change the institutions of planning to make amends for those past harms that have been caused. And more recently, in recent years, this idea of trauma-informed and healing-centered urban planning and defining what that means. So a definition for us that we have kind of tried to operationalize in our work is, one, as a 2-part definition. One, the healing effects that the act of emotionally and culturally responsive planning can have with the groups that we're working with, the groups that have experienced collective trauma. And then secondly, what are the actions that are needed to transform the institutions of planning to stop those systems of harm and make amends for past harms? Okay, so I'll talk about 2 projects here that I'm leading or have led. The first is a Hope for Heat Resilience project. That's a big kind of participatory action research project that's funded by the NSF. And then on the right there is the second project about a case with the Friends of Evans Spring, which is a resident activist group that my students last semester worked with in a collaborative planning class. So Hope for Heat Resilience, the long name of this grant is called Youth-Centered Civic Technology, Science and Art for Community Heat Resilience, where HOPE is an acronym actually that stands for Healing Our People with Empathy. It's part of, as I mentioned, it's funded by the NSF Civic Innovation Challenge, which funded 19 teams nationwide last year. We each received $1 million for a 1-year grant, which is crazy fast and a lot of money. And so we're right in the middle of that right now, so it's been an interesting ride. But essentially the premise of the Civic Innovation Program is that it flips the traditional research and development concept. So you think of typically NSF funds basic research, applied research, and then dissemination or translation or broader impacts, right? This actually starts with a community-led project where the research questions themselves are defined by the community. So in this case, it was the issue of heat. When we already know, as I mentioned, the heat is an issue in Roanoke, and we, just to say that we don't think that there's a such thing as a natural disaster, right? Disaster follows from our failure to plan for natural hazards. And risk is a combination of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, and I just reiterate that this is the map of Roanoke, and so the area that we're working in is primarily northwest, which is that a lot of the African-American community there, and it is exposed to higher temperatures, but also has higher levels of social vulnerability that are compounded by these social economic factors that kind of spatially overlay with that. So urban planners think that we have some tools, right, to deal with temperatures in cities. And these can be informed by quantitative data and science, right? So things like changing the albedo of rooftops so that more of the energy is reflected back into the atmosphere, greening vacant lots, putting in innovative green infrastructure improvements, again, to cool and to shade, infrastructure improvements like splash pads so that people have places to cool down, preserving urban forests, and then putting in shade structures. But the challenge is how to go about implementing these, especially given the context in which urban planners are viewed with high levels of distrust about who these interventions are actually for. So I want to tell the story of one of the first meetings that I had with one of my community partners on this HOPE project. He had stopped showing up to our planning meetings for this civic innovation program, where we were trying to define what the parameters of our grant would be and what our activities would be. And so I went to go find him in his office, which is located in part of an area near downtown Roanoke called Gainsboro, which was a historically African-American neighborhood that was essentially destroyed by urban renewal. So on the left there is what it looks like today. Lots of empty vacant lots, empty parking lots, not very sparse buildings and things. His office is located there. When I got out of my car and I met him out there, he started pointing at these lots, naming dozens of individuals, business names, church names, pointing at this, what I saw as an empty, weedy lot. And I just realized at that moment that I need to learn how to see what he sees of his own community. What you see on the right there is what this same street, Henry Street, looked like pre-urban renewal, which in Roanoke happened from the 50s all the way through the 90s. You can see that it's bustling, right? The Ebony Club there, they've got Duke Ellington coming to perform. The Dumas Hotel was like a major stop for African-American travelers. It was just a bustling place, and this is what people remember, right? So what is the typical urban planning process? Just to give you guys an idea of how, strategic urban planning often works, right? So you have an issue that's defined by the planning department. In this case, it might be heat. You assemble data and analyze it. Experts help with that. Solutions are prescribed. You get input from the community to increase the buy-in to those solutions, and then you try to implement those solutions. And then, wow, you find all this pushback happens at that stage. The community is not on board. I want to say that, respond in a way that allows people to be heard, which is one of our 4 principles of trauma-informed planning. This is not an opportunity for people to be heard at the last step. So what we're trying to do with our Hope for Heat Resilience project is flip that on its head. I said that the Civic Innovation Project is trying to break down these hierarchies between research and community member, but also in our field between planner or expert and resident. So we have a completely grassroots planning approach that is not only grassroots from the residents, but starts with a voice that is often completely left out of the room, which is youth. So we start with the planning of very broad youth arts and spirituality programs, youth environmental science programs that are place-based. Those produce artifacts of all kinds, artwork, data sets, music, performance art, all kinds of things, right? Those artifacts are then used by a high school planning, a group of 8 high school planners that are being trained in some of the skills of urban planning and have a lot of interaction with our graduate students at Virginia Tech who are learning to be urban planners themselves, to make plans for their own community. So these high school students are from Northwest, they identify with the African American community, and they're making plans for their own community to increase community resilience. All of the artifacts also go into a digital hub, because one thing that we've heard repeatedly from the community is they feel surveyed to death, but they can never figure out how the feedback from their surveys is actually connecting with plans. And so one function of the digital hub is to make that to connect all the artifacts to the plans, to the community listening sessions and all that inform the neighborhood plans. And then at the top is, we hope that those plans will be accepted by the city. Okay, so what are some examples of the things that we are doing? So this is the Hope Center in Roanoke. They just got their 501(c) status, but before that, they were operating completely out of pocket through personal donations from the director, Miss Darlene Lewis here on the left, to provide all kinds of social services. It's like a hub where children can go after school if their parents are not home, people can get food, pick up clothing. In the summer, she found herself handing out bottles of water to just people who are underhoused or living in their cars or whatever, walking to the transit station there, and finding herself running out of water. And she's already essentially serving as a resilience hub of sorts, as providing a critical service to the community. So how can we build on the assets of the community, existing assets of the community, and redirect resources to these already existing trusted organizations? So she's a part of this program, and we're connecting her with other organizations, so there's cross-organizational learning happening, and learning how to navigate some of those city processes as well about getting resources. We also have monthly all-hands meetings, so because we've broadened the participation to youth, there are tons of organizations in the city of Roanoke that work with youth. And so we've got like 25 unique community-based organizations and government agencies that are coming to our all-hands meetings talking about heat, the issue of heat, but really talking about much more than that, how to coordinate, how to work together. And so these meetings have been really, really fruitful, because we also talk about what it means to operationalize trauma-informed practice. So we do things like mindfulness together and are trying to establish these kind of like cultural practices that we all adopt together to better work together, because there's also kind of a lot of conflict within the community. So there's things that need to be worked through together, right, in this space. Examples of the arts program. So broadening it to what is our relationship with urban nature and what is our experiences with urban heat? How have we coped in the past? We also have churches involved, because churches in the community are important kind of social hubs and also physical hubs where people can seek out refuge from the heat, but also get information, connect with other people. This idea of social infrastructure, right, building that connectivity is really important, because often in a disaster like a heat wave or any other disaster, your first responders are your neighbors, right? And so the more we can strengthen that connectivity and participation, the more we think that that's going to be a positive outcome for the community. Some examples of our high school students here interacting with our graduate students. They're all on a tour here on the right-hand side. That's a picture of a walking tour that we went on of urban renewal in the Gainsborough neighborhood, led by, on the right there you see what is called a griot. That's a holder of oral history in the African American community, Jordan Bell. And so what's really important from this kind of thing is that the high school students from the African American community see that the stories are held in their own community and that they're telling their own stories, and have the space to do that. So some of hearing about things like urban renewal, like systemic violence that has been committed against the African American community, is really hard to hear. That's not the only example, but it is one major example in kind of the imagination of the residents here. We want to make sure to resist re-traumatization of these youth, right, as we're doing this. And so in every instance where there is something that's difficult to grapple with, like how did this happen to my community, we pair it with a kind of healing-centered activity. So this is an example of a community listening circle that we ran right after the walking tour, where the students, both the high school students that are involved and my graduate students, were talking about what community means to them and kind of digesting what it meant to hear about the difficult history of the past. And this is led by another partner on our team, Kula Makusina, who's a trained kind of indigenous African priest, and he kind of brings that spirituality component to it as well. So to summarize this project, I really like this quotation from one of my community members. She said, "Heat resilience is the name, but it ain't the game." We happen to be working on the issue of how to increase community capacity to deal with rising temperatures. But from the community member's perspective, it's about much more than that. It's how to mobilize community resources and recognize assets of the community and have concrete ways to build on those assets and get material kind of support for those assets and know how to navigate that. So that means recognizing the work of the community centers that are already functioning as resilience hubs and not trying to redo things from a new perspective, but building on what they already have. Cultural changes such as mindfulness and time for reflection and internal work through the planning process, broadening participation, that idea of intergenerational organizing, and then promoting confidence of young people to improve their own community. All right, so second project here. This is a collaborative planning exercise that my students and I went through with a resident activist group called the Friends of Evans Spring, also located in Northwest Roanoke. Evans Spring is this area right here. You can kind of see it's this little blue bubble here. It's like an oasis in that sea of red. It's 150 acres. Most of it is forested. But in 2020, the city there were plans to develop this Evans Spring area that were reignited. And so that caused a lot of pushback from the African American community because it included intensive commercial and residential development, and then also a highway interchange. So you can imagine that given the history of urban renewal, that sounds really similar to that. And urban renewal is, of course, fresh in the minds of many of these residents that lived through it and were displaced to Northwest from Gainsborough through urban renewal. The Friends of Evans Spring is the most prominent resident group that has kind of risen up to organize efforts to resist the development of that area. And so this is what Evans Spring looks like today. There's a wetland there. I was aware that this group was up against some real challenges because they wanted to completely preserve that area as a nature park, but the parcels there are privately owned and also already zoned as low-density residential. And the city was not keen on acquiring the properties to establish a nature park. So we had that's kind of a hard place to be in. But I volunteered to use my graduate course, which is called Collaborative Planning and Community Engagement, to see what we could do for the group. So from the beginning, although it was pretty unclear what we could contribute to their objective, it was clear that we needed a trauma-informed and healing-centered approach to sensitively and authentically engage with the members of the Friends of Evans Spring. Because we know that trauma is present in the daily lives of these residents, high levels of poverty, high levels of substance use, crime and violence, gun violence, that are all continuing to contribute to this experience of spatialized trauma. And we also know that those issues are all inextricably linked to past planning and institutions and policy decisions that have contributed to spatial segregation by race and class and this intergenerational community level trauma. So what happened over the 15 weeks of the semester? We all found ourselves changed by this process of deep community engagement. So in short, we thought that if the process of deep community engagement that we went through, us meaning from Virginia Tech, with the Friends of Evans Spring could change us as complete outsiders to this issue and this community, we thought that this might point to a path for cultural change for the institutions of planning as well, through the adopting of principles of trauma-informed community engagement. So I'll get into that in a moment. So this was in 2022, the City Council voted to hire an external consultant to work on a plan for this area, and this is what they came up with. You can see the interchange there, the big box store, some medium box retail and small box retail and residential development. The consultant, did community engagement, or they claimed to come up with a list of non-negotiables through 16 interviews with the community. And they assumed that if they avoided those non-negotiables, that the community would have to be satisfied with what they came up with, and this is what they came up with. But many of those residents in the broader community were very dissatisfied with the type of community engagement that was conducted. They referred to the engagement as false choices and manufactured consent, and they were really, really angry. And this disagreement became very public. So this is kind of what we're stepping into. Our approach was to view the planning process as one of storytelling. So my students came into the issue that knowing it was charged and controversial, and they really wanted to step back and ask, what is the underlying problem here that we're trying to address? These are some of the things that they did. They ran listening circles. They had the residents do these fill-in-the-blank stories, envisioning the past and the future, and then really making space to communicate emotion and what was emerging from both processing the past and visioning various scenarios for the future. So through this, my students learned the story of Northwest as told by the residents of Northwest. They learned that despite its reputation as crime-ridden and violent, there's also this deep sense of pride and mutual aid, a culture of mutual aid that's under-recognized. And we learned that Evans Spring represented freedom, youth, independence to the residents. They had beautiful memories of riding bikes through the forest, eating fruit from the trees, and playing in a swimming hole. And the vision for Evans Spring is really connected to the residents' past experiences of nature and the city, and the motivation surrounding Evans Spring is connected with that betrayal that they also felt associated with urban renewal. So at the end of this exercise, the students felt like they began to understand more of what the problem was. It was actually that the residents felt devalued, ignored, and disrespected by the city's officials who they thought should be representing them. I won't dwell on this, but there were, in our sessions with them, the residents also reported things that we might associate with community healing. So feelings of trust and through the engagement process, strengthened social supports with each other, the ability to create a coherent narrative for themselves about what has happened, and then improved self-efficacy. But what I really want to focus on actually is my students and I, what changed through us in this process of trauma-informed and healing-centered planning. We experienced a lot of uncertainty and anxiety through this process. There were many conflicting facts and interpretations of truth that all seemed plausible to us. The students both empathized with the stories from the city's planners about having to balance difficult trade-offs and development decisions, and with the residents' kind of deeply emotional stories of loss and pain and grief from urban renewal and the destruction of community and feeling ignored. And so amongst all this uncertainty and anxiety that we were feeling, many of us took away this message of, instead of trying to evaluate the truth of the situation, which is an intellectual exercise, it was actually more important for us to actuate how to be from a place of neighborly love. And I was really moved when one of my students, he was just 22 years old, came to me with this quotation by the theologian C.S. Lewis as a way that he thought could help us find a path forward. It says, "The rule for us is perfectly simple. Do not waste time bothering whether you love your neighbor. Act as if you did. As soon as we do this, we find one of the greatest secrets. When you're behaving as if you loved someone, you will presently come to love him." So we experienced this conscious reorientation toward emotions and values, and this reorientation was caused by this recognition of the limitations of intellectual understanding. Intellectually, we understand that this case, the development of Evans Spring, is not the same as the illegal takings of African Americans' properties during urban renewal, right? Including for allowing for upzoning is not the same technically. But we also learned to recognize the affective meaning behind the phrase urban renewal 2.0, which was being used by the residents in the case of Evans Spring. So this process of deeply relating to people, to be vulnerable in the fact that we actually had no idea whether we could actually make any difference with this group, and still yet be willing to listen to another's pain and hope, actually, made us deeply reflect on what the role and the point of community engagement should be. So at the final presentation back to the Friends of Evans Spring, my students used these 10 principles of community engagement that comes from Patricia Wilson's book here. And I won't read all of them, but kind of core to all of them is how to practice empathy and humility. And in our final presentation back to the Friends of Evans Spring, they presented how the process of deep community engagement transformed them, and what they described as a shift in the understanding of the point of community engagement, not necessarily to prescribe solutions, but as a process of healing and becoming neighbors. And at the end, these are some of the quotes that the students read back to the Friends of Evans Spring about how they felt they were changed through that process. At the end of the students' presentation, many of us from both Virginia Tech and the Friends of Evans Spring were in tears. That was like the first time that they felt like they had been actually listened to by an outsider. So in our final debrief, the Friends of Evans Spring requested that we make the same presentation to City Council, demonstrating the power of trauma-informed and healing-centered community engagement. And they wanted us to say, if the point of planning is to generate opportunities to heal, if the point of planning is to generate opportunities to become neighbors and to exhibit neighborly love, that's what we should be going towards. They wanted me to present those 10 principles of Patricia Wilson's 10 principles to this as guidelines, essentially, for all future community engagement in the city of Roanoke. And they thought it could be transformative for the city's culture, just as it was for us. So that presentation to City Council actually did happen a few weeks ago. And unfortunately, I can't report that it was a total success, as these kind of things are often not. But there were glimpses that our message was heard. So this is when they were deliberating about what I presented. This is something that the vice mayor said, right? You can see that he's using the language, recognizing that trauma hasn't been addressed, that the work of healing is necessary, and that it is through conversations and engagement that healing can be done. So in conclusion, here's kind of how our work, these two projects fit in our two kind of pieces of the definition for trauma-informed healing-centered planning. First, the healing effects that the act of emotionally and culturally responsive planning can have with the groups themselves. That was kind of the first part of the presentation. The second is the actions that are needed to transform the institutions of planning to stop those systems of harm and make amends for those past harms. And for me, and for my students, I guess what's been revealed is that we play a really big role in transforming ourselves in that process. I will skip over this for time. There have been some other kind of things that have emerged following that City Council meeting, which we can, if people have questions about, acknowledging some of the leaders on our project here. This is an example of two aerial photos of the city of Roanoke, one from 2008 and one from 2018. And what I want to point out here is that the city actually looks very similar between 10 years. So what has changed? What does transformation mean when everything looks the same? Well, it's us, right? The transformation has to begin with how we do things differently. And this is something that one of our community partners often says, the only way out is in. Thank you.